She wore a polo shirt embroidered with the San Antonio Veterans Memorial Park logo, and that was all Ronald Kemper saw. A volunteer coordinator. Clipboard in hand. Efficient but unremarkable. He had no idea the hands adjusting the memorial wreaths had performed 14 combat surgeries under direct enemy fire. He didn't know that across 3 continents, soldiers whispered her call sign in the dark, Nightingale 6, the voice that meant you were going to live. The morning sun cut across the park's main plaza at 8:56 a.m., and Megan O'Brien moved through the community outreach event with the quiet precision of someone who had learned long ago that noise gets people killed. Her movements were economical. No wasted motion. No flourish. She directed volunteer crews toward the registration tables, adjusted the angle of memorial wreaths so the morning light caught them right, guided a wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran named Frank toward the shaded seating area with a gentleness that made him grip her hand like she was the only solid thing in the world. 8 months she'd been working here. 8 months of checking boxes on forms and wearing this shirt and pretending that the limp favoring her left leg came from a hiking accident instead of shrapnel that still occasionally shifted when the weather changed. In her locker inside the park's maintenance building, wrapped in plastic beneath her jacket, sat a folded flag. Not just any flag. The burial flag from Major Sarah Chen's service, laid to rest in Baghdad in 2009 with full military honors. The flag was the only piece of that deployment Megan carried openly, and she touched it each morning before her shift the way other people touched religious medals or photos. Her fingers would trace the sharp creases, and for exactly 3 seconds, she would let the weight of it settle, the weight of decisions made under fire, of hands that had chosen which lives could be saved and which would have to wait, of a best friend who didn't make it home. Then she locked the locker and stepped into the morning as Megan O'Brien, volunteer. Park Director Ronald Kemper's office occupied the 2nd floor of the administrative building, corner windows overlooking the entire plaza. He was a man whose suits cost more than some people's cars, whose watches gleamed with the kind of quiet wealth that whispered rather than shouted. This morning, his laptop displayed a spreadsheet titled Memorial Fund Q3 Distribution, which was actually a carefully constructed network of phantom contractor invoices, offshore account routing numbers, and falsified vendor receipts. The Memorial Fund had received $847,000 in donations over the past 6 months. Approximately $340,000 had made its way to legitimate memorial maintenance. The rest had taken a more scenic route through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. It was elegant work. It was also profitable work. And it would have remained undetected if Megan O'Brien hadn't asked exactly 3 questions during last month's volunteer coordination meeting. Who's the contractor on the plaza restoration invoice for $89,000? I don't recognize this vendor name. Can you provide their business registration? The donation tracking doesn't balance. Where did the $47,500 discrepancy go? The questions had been casual. Polite. The kind of questions any competent volunteer might ask when reviewing the publicly available fund allocation reports. But Kemper had watched her face as she asked them, and he'd seen the micro-expression that came right after, that slight pause, that moment when she was clearly running calculations in her head, cross-referencing numbers, recognizing a pattern the way people did when they'd been trained to notice inconsistencies in hostile environments. Kemper didn't know her military background. He'd seen her application, volunteer coordinator, prior nursing experience, references from Cedar Creek Medical. But he knew a threat when he saw one, and her competence around veterans was becoming exactly that. He deflected her questions with administrative vagueness and made a mental note to monitor her more closely. His phone buzzed at 9:12 a.m. Text from his accountant, Cayman transfer confirmed. $140,000. Next batch ready for routing. Kemper smiled and deleted the message. Whatever Megan O'Brien might suspect, she was just a volunteer. She had no authority. No leverage. And the Memorial Fund discrepancies? Those would never hold up to scrutiny. His accountant was meticulous. Down in the plaza, the community outreach event was hitting its stride. Captain Derek Haynes had arrived in civilian clothes, blue polo shirt, jeans, baseball cap that said Veterans Leadership Initiative, and was standing near the memorial fountain, shaking hands with other veterans, his posture that perfect military bearing that never really left a person's body no matter how many years had passed since the last uniform. Haynes was 63, a ranger who'd done 4 tours and who ran a support network for vets struggling with combat-related injuries. Good man. Solid. The kind of person Kemper barely registered as he stood at his window, distracted by the accounting software on his screen. Megan was reviewing the registration checklist with one of the younger volunteers, a college kid named Marcus who'd been coming to help out on weekends. She was showing him how to flag the forms that indicated veterans requiring accessible parking or dietary accommodations, her voice steady and patient, her hands making small gestures that somehow made complex information seem simple. "See how the checkbox is here," she said, tapping the form with a pen. "That tells us everything we need to know about setup logistics." Details matter. Details had always mattered to her. In a field hospital in Kandahar, details meant the difference between a salvageable hemorrhage and a body bag. Details meant knowing which instruments were in which pouch without looking, knowing exactly how long you had before shock became irreversible, knowing that a 14-gauge angiocath needle inserted at the right angle could restore life to a collapsed lung in under 90 seconds. Details had been her world for 12 years and 3 tours. Now they meant knowing that Frank preferred to sit in the shade because bright light triggered his migraines, and that the registration tables should be positioned with the sun at veterans' backs so they weren't squinting. At 9:27 a.m., Captain Haynes turned to walk toward the memorial wall, and his foot caught the edge of one of the plaza's decorative pavers. A small stumble. Nothing serious. Except his body didn't correct itself the way it should have. His shoulders didn't adjust. His legs didn't reset. He went down like someone had cut the strings holding him up, and he went down hard, his head barely missing the concrete edge of the fountain by 8 inches. The plaza went quiet. The kind of silence that happens when something suddenly isn't right, when the brain registers catastrophe before the mouth can form words. Megan was already moving. Not running. Walking fast, but with purpose, with the kind of movement that didn't create panic. By the time she reached Haynes, she was already running her eyes over him the way she'd been trained: pupil responsiveness, respiratory rate, color, bleeding, obvious fractures. His left arm was bent at an angle that meant probable break. His eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing was rapid. Shallow. There was a gash on his temple, bleeding steadily, and when she checked his neck, his skin was clammy. "Captain Haynes. Can you hear me?" Her voice was quiet. Clinical. She was already positioning him, assessing, running through protocols that lived in her muscle memory like second nature. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for spinal injury, evaluating responsiveness, noting the exact moment when his pupils dilated and refocused on her face. The limp was gone now. The volunteer coordinator was gone. What remained was pure competence, hands steady as surgical steel, breathing controlled, every movement economical and precise. "I'm fine," Haynes slurred. "Just tripped." You hit your head." "You're not fine." "Stay still." Her hands found the bleeding on his temple, applied pressure with the heel of her palm, angled his jaw slightly to monitor his airway. She was cataloging everything. Mechanism of injury: fall from standing. Loss of consciousness: probable, based on the confusion. Bleeding: controlled now, maybe 4 centimeters of laceration. Heart rate: elevated. Her fingers found his radial pulse without him asking, strong, regular, but too fast. Tachycardic. Which meant something had happened before the fall. Something inside that had made him collapse. Marcus appeared with the first aid kit, and without looking away from Haynes, Megan was already reaching for it, already moving. "Call 911, she said. "Tell them we have a 63-year-old male, fall mechanism, loss of consciousness, head laceration, elevated pulse, altered mental status on arrival. ETA needed. Tell them we're at San Antonio Veterans Memorial Park, Plaza area." Up in his office, Ronald Kemper watched through the window as a handful of volunteers converged on the collapsed veteran. He watched as Megan knelt beside him with the kind of authority that made people step back without being told. He watched as she worked, her hands moving with a precision that suggested exactly one thing: she'd done this before. Not as a volunteer. Not as a nurse filing paperwork at Cedar Creek Medical, where her employment record showed she'd left after 3 years with a commendation and no explanation. She'd done this when it mattered. When the stakes were life and death and there was nothing but her hands and whatever equipment was available. Kemper's jaw tightened. His hands balled into fists. Because he understood in that moment what her questions about the memorial fund had really been. She wasn't just asking casually. She was investigating. She had the kind of mind that noticed patterns, that understood discrepancies, that could probably trace a financial thread all the way back to its source if given enough time. And now, watching her work on a collapse victim with the confidence of someone who'd done it dozens of times, he realized that Megan O'Brien was very possibly the most dangerous person in this entire park. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had no idea he'd seen her recognition, her competence, her completely undisguised ability to save a life using nothing but her hands and her mind. And now he had to decide what to do about a volunteer coordinator who'd stumbled into knowledge she was never supposed to have. Captain Haynes stabilized as the ambulance pulled into the park, lights flashing. His pupils responded to light. His breathing normalized. Color returned to his face. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was alert enough to tell them his name, though his arm still hung at that terrible angle, and his hand was shaking in a way that suggested he understood he'd been maybe 9 seconds away from not waking up at all. Megan stepped back as they loaded him onto the stretcher, her polo shirt untucked now from the work, a small smudge of blood on her collar that she didn't acknowledge. She handed the paramedics his chart of vitals with the same precision she'd handled everything else: heart rate 98, blood pressure 142/89, respiration rate 18, O2 saturation 96% on room air. "Good work, miss," one of the paramedics said. "He'd have been in a lot worse shape if you hadn't been here." Megan nodded. "Get him to Cedar Creek Medical. Have neuro check him for subdural hematoma. The fall was hard, and he had a loss of consciousness interval." She didn't explain how she knew. She just stated facts with the certainty of someone who'd held enough broken skulls in her hands to recognize the patterns. By 10:04 a.m., the plaza had returned to something resembling normal. Volunteers reset the registration tables. The memorial wreaths were straightened. Frank, the wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran, was telling another vet about what he'd just witnessed, his voice full of wonder. "That girl," he was saying. "That volunteer. She saved that captain's life. I've been in hospitals for 3 years after my stroke, and I've never seen someone move like that. Like she knew exactly what she was doing." In his office, Ronald Kemper closed his laptop and sat very still in the afternoon light, thinking about the problem that had just presented itself. A competent person was dangerous. A competent person with medical training was more dangerous. A competent person with medical training who could recognize financial discrepancies and apparently spent her days trying to help people was the most dangerous kind of all. He picked up his phone and dialed his accountant. "We need to accelerate the timeline," he said quietly. "And we need to make sure our volunteer coordinator stays very busy with other things. Very far from the memorial fund paperwork." "Clear." The conversation lasted 43 seconds, and by the time it ended, Ronald Kemper had already begun to think about how to handle his problem. He just didn't know yet that the problem had been handling itself since the day she walked through his park's gates. The morning light cut across the Memorial Plaza in sharp white lines as Ronald Kemper descended the stone steps from his office, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble with the precision of a metronome. He'd rehearsed this conversation 7 times in the shower. He needed witnesses. He needed the narrative shaped before Captain Haynes could speak to anyone else. The Patterson family stood at the Gold Star wall, hands pressed against engraved names, their youngest daughter crying silently into her mother's shoulder. Perfect. Megan had just arrived for her shift, crossing toward the supply closet with a stack of inventory forms. Kemper angled his path to intercept her directly in front of the family. His voice carried across the plaza like a bell toll. "Miss O'Brien, we need to discuss your unauthorized medical intervention yesterday." Megan stopped. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as stone. Captain Haynes was in respiratory distress. "Standard protocol." I stabilized him until the paramedics. Kemper stepped closer, his voice rising, loud enough for the Patterson family to turn and watch. "You are a volunteer coordinator. Not a paramedic. Not a nurse on duty. Not authorized to provide medical care on park property. Do you understand the liability you've created?" He leaned in, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper that somehow carried farther than his shout. "Playing hero won't fix whatever you're running from, clipboard queen." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Patterson's jaw tightened. She gathered her daughters closer, shooting Megan a look that mixed pity with suspicion, and they walked away from the wall they'd come to honor. Megan's jaw clenched once, a single muscle spasm, then released. She exhaled through her nose with the controlled precision of someone who'd learned long ago that breathing was a weapon you could master. "Understood," she said, her voice flat as concrete. She turned toward the supply closet without waiting for dismissal. Kemper watched her go, satisfied. The narrative was set. Megan O'Brien was the problem. She'd overstepped. She was reckless. He'd prevented a disaster by containing her. That afternoon, a formal written warning appeared on the employee bulletin board beside the break room, Kemper's handwriting crisp and official, inappropriate conduct and insubordination. Volunteer O'Brien overstepped role boundaries, creating legal liability through unauthorized medical intervention. Reassignment to facility maintenance effective immediately. Restricted from all veteran-facing duties pending further review. When Megan entered the break room at noon, 3 staff members, Jorge, the groundskeeper with 17 years of service, Linda, the receptionist who'd smiled at her every morning for 8 months, Martin, the event coordinator who'd asked her advice on veteran protocols, gathered their lunches without a word and filed out like pallbearers. They left behind the echo of their departure and the faint smell of microwaved food and abandonment. She sat alone at the table, eating her sandwich with mechanical precision, eyes forward on nothing. The silence wasn't accidental. Kemper had made a phone call to each of them that morning. "For your own protection, maintain professional distance from Miss O'Brien. She's created liability issues. You don't want your judgment questioned if you're seen socializing with her." The message was surgical. Not forbidden. Just implied. The next day, Kemper called her into his office at 4:24 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before her shift ended. He didn't invite her to sit. He slid a revised schedule across his desk, the paper crisp, the handwriting precise. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned to facility maintenance. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And you're banned from all veteran events. Your presence makes families uncomfortable after your stunt." Megan picked up the schedule. Her hands were steady. Her fingers brushed against something in her jacket pocket, a folded flag, worn at the creases, the fabric soft as prayer, before. She pulled her hand away and stood. The flag was from Baghdad, 2009. It had draped a coffin at Forward Operating Base Victory. She'd carried it for 14 years, folded exactly the same way, kept in her locker during work hours, moved to her jacket pocket during nights when insomnia wore her down to nothing. Most people would have broken at this point. Most people would have thrown the schedule back at Kemper, would have recited their qualifications, would have trembled or cried or demanded fairness. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, a muscle that had learned to hold back a tidal wave of competence and rage and capability. "When do I start?" Megan asked. Kemper smiled. It was the smile of someone who believed he'd won. "Tonight." That night at 10 p.m., Megan arrived at the San Antonio Veterans Memorial Park wearing khaki pants and a gray maintenance shirt with her name embroidered in small letters. The park transformed at night, all the dignity of daytime dissolved into fluorescent work lights and the soft hiss of the irrigation system cycling through its evening watering. She mopped the Memorial Plaza floors with long, methodical strokes, her nursing coordinator cover now reduced to emptying trash cans and scrubbing foundation tiles where visitors' tears had dried into salt stains. Her real mission, the assignment from Army intelligence to monitor suspected smuggling operations using veteran memorial shipment containers, was slipping away. She'd been systematically cut off from cargo manifests, delivery schedules, warehouse access codes. The pattern she'd identified over 8 months of careful observation was fragmenting. The encrypted phone in her pocket buzzed at 11:43 p.m. Need confirmation on next shipment ETA. Status. Her handler. Waiting. She stared at the message, then at her reflection in the dark memorial wall windows, and didn't reply. She couldn't reply. Confirmation required access she no longer had. Access that Kemper had revoked. For weeks into the janitorial assignment, during her shift at 10:27 p.m., Captain Derek Haynes appeared in the parking lot as she arrived for work. He was out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes, but his posture carried the shape of a soldier, shoulders back, spine straight, the kind of invisible alignment that marked someone who'd spent 2 decades being told to stand at attention. "You saved my life," he said, extending his hand. She shook it, her movements precise but guarded. "You were in VTAC. Standard intervention." As they talked, she adjusted his stance unconsciously, shoulders back, chin level to optimize his breathing mechanics as his lungs continued their slow recovery. Haynes froze mid-sentence. His eyes locked on her hands. "Camp Victory, 2009, he whispered. His voice had changed entirely, carrying the weight of recognition. "You're the medic who did the field thoracotomy on Major Chen using nothing but a Leatherman and for tubing. Nightingale 6. That was you." Her expression didn't shift. Not even a flicker. "You're mistaken," she said, and stepped back, breaking contact. She'd spent years training her face not to respond to that name. Nightingale 6. The call sign from another life. Another identity. A past that was supposed to stay buried. Haynes opened his mouth to respond, to push, to say more, but Kemper's voice crackled over the parking lot speaker system, distorted and authoritative. "Brian, main plaza needs attention. Now." She walked away without another word, leaving Haynes standing alone beneath the streetlight, his recognition hanging in the air like a question no one had asked yet. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked with the same measured pace she'd maintained for the past 4 weeks, invisible, unremarkable, just another night maintenance worker doing her job while the world around her had no idea that the person mopping floors at midnight had held the line at a forward operating base in Helmand Province. That she'd performed emergency thoracotomies with field-expedient tools. That she'd saved the lives of 14 coalition soldiers and 23 Afghan civilians. That the folded flag in her locker represented someone who died in her arms at 3 a.m. while she was trying to keep her hand steady enough to work. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. She reached the main plaza and found the water fountain circulating its quiet cycle, the memorial tiles reflecting back the night sky like a mirror of something she'd lost a long time ago. The mop felt familiar in her hands. The work felt like penance. But her hands were steady. They were always steady. The mop handle was aluminum. Cold. Megan gripped it at 11:47 p.m., pushing dirty water across the Memorial Plaza's marble tiles while the park sat empty around her. Maintenance coveralls hung loose on her frame, navy blue, embroidered with a faded park logo on the chest pocket. Her name tag read custodial staff. Not volunteer coordinator. Not a nursing professional. Just a mop and a midnight shift and the sound of water sluicing across stone that had been dedicated to the dead. She'd been doing this for 3 weeks. 21 nights of janitorial work while Kemper consolidated power behind closed office doors. The park director had spent those 3 weeks making phone calls. Megan had learned that much from overhearing fragments in the hallway, conversations with board members, their voices shifting from skeptical to cooperative once Kemper mentioned how much the Memorial Fund appreciated their counsel. She didn't need to hear the full sentences. She'd spent 14 years reading subtext in military briefings. The money was flowing. The loyalties were shifting. And she was emptying trash cans. The plaza fountains needed scrubbing tomorrow. The memorial wall's bronze plaques were developing water spots. The flagpole base had bird droppings that required a specific solvent. Kemper had itemized her new duties on a clipboard, his smile tight as he handed it to her that first night. "We need to maintain standards," he'd said. "For the veterans." She'd nodded. Said nothing. Her hands remained steady. Now, at nearly midnight, the only sound was the mop bucket's wheels, metal squeaking against marble, and the distant hum of the park's perimeter lights. Megan worked the northeast quadrant first, methodical. 23 years of discipline meant she could clean a plaza while her brain remained elsewhere, tracking timelines. The intelligence operation was hemorrhaging. 3 weeks of janitorial work meant no access to memorial fund records, no proximity to the park director's office, no chance to document the patterns she'd been closing in on. The smuggling network had gone dormant or moved locations. Either way, her cover was collapsing into literal maintenance work. The footsteps startled her only because she heard them at all. Most people didn't walk the Memorial Plaza at midnight. Most people were asleep, or home, or living normal lives that didn't involve black site operations and offshore account monitoring. These footsteps were deliberate. Measured. Military cadence, even at a casual pace. Megan didn't turn. She kept the mop moving, water spreading across the tiles in even strokes. "Ms. O'Brien." She knew that voice. Captain Derek Haynes. The Army Ranger she'd saved 3 weeks ago when his heart had tried to stop itself mid-collapse. She'd pushed compressions into his chest with the kind of precision that came from having practiced on actual corpses in combat medicine training. And then Kemper had made her invisible, reassigned her, buried her so deep that Haynes probably thought he'd dreamed her competence. Megan set the mop down slowly, turned. Haynes stood 40 feet away in civilian clothes, blue jeans, a grey quarter-zip pullover, his posture slightly favoring his right side. The shoulder where he'd taken shrapnel in Kandahar, maybe. Or the old thoracic surgery scar she'd felt beneath his shirt when she'd been performing compressions 3 weeks ago. "Captain," she said. Quiet. Neutral. The mop bucket dripped behind her. He walked closer. His gait showed compensation, protecting something in his left ribcage. Recent pain, or old pain that had never healed right. Megan's eyes tracked the asymmetry the way a computer tracks a cursor. Instinct. Training. 14 years of reading bodies the way other people read books. "I had to thank you properly," Haynes said. He stood 5 feet away now, close enough that she could see the tension lines around his mouth. "Park director told me I wasn't allowed to speak with you. Told everyone, actually. That you'd overstepped. I was just providing first aid." Her voice didn't change. The way she'd learned in the Rangers, same cadence, same volume, whether you were telling someone they were going to be fine or that they were going to die in the next 60 seconds. "You were doing what a medic does," Haynes corrected. He breathed carefully, his left side staying rigid. "Mind if I sit?" There was a bench 5 feet away, part of the memorial's landscaping. Megan gestured toward it with the mop handle, which was ridiculous, but she didn't lower it. The bench was there. He could sit if he wanted. He did. Slowly, with the precision of someone who knew exactly which muscles would cause pain. Once settled, he breathed easier, shallow breaths, controlled. Megan watched. Then she moved. The movement wasn't planned. Her body simply understood. She crossed the space between them, set the mop down, and stood in front of him. Haynes looked up, confused, as she reached out and adjusted his posture. Her hands on his shoulders, pressing him back and slightly left, opening the angle of his ribcage. His breath immediately became less labored. She held him there, maybe 5 seconds, long enough for his nervous system to recognize the easier configuration. Then she stepped back. "Breathe," she said. He did. Slower. Deeper. His eyes closed for a moment, relief crossing his features like a wave. When he opened them again, they were focused on her hands. Just her hands. The calluses across her palms. The scars between her knuckles, marks from 14 years of field medicine, from trauma shears and needle passes and holding compression on bleeding wounds while explosions rearranged the architecture around you. Haynes stared at those hands for 3 full seconds. The plaza was so quiet that Megan could hear the water dripping from the mop bucket, each drop hitting the tile like a tiny clock. Tick. 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 Camp Victory, 2009, Haynes whispered. His voice had changed. Lower. Different. Nightingale 6. You're the medic who did the field thoracotomy on Major Chen using nothing but a Leatherman and for tubing. Megan didn't move. Didn't blink. The statement wasn't a question, so she didn't treat it like one. The night air felt suddenly very thin. The medevac wasn't coming, Haynes continued, still staring at her hands. Chen had massive hemothorax. He was losing pressure by the minute. You told everyone to step back, told Chen you were going to open his chest with a knife and a multitool because it was the only way. You did it in 8 minutes. Surgical precision. During incoming fire. He finally looked up at her face. He lived another 6 years. Died of cancer in 2015, saw his daughter graduate high school. You gave him 6 extra years. That was a long time ago, Megan said. I was there, Haynes said. 3rd platoon. I watched you work. I watched your hand stop shaking the moment you decided to cut. His breathing had become easier now, steadier. The posture adjustment was holding. That park director told me you were just a volunteer who overstepped. That you didn't have proper medical authorization. Megan picked the mop back up. The bucket had cooled by now, the water turning grey. She needed to change it out. The memorial wall's bronze plaques weren't going to polish themselves, and Kemper had been very specific about standards. You should go home, Captain, she said. Rest that shoulder. But Haynes didn't stand immediately. He sat on the bench while she returned to the plaza, pushing the mop across tiles that had been dedicated to soldiers just like him. Soldiers who'd served. Who'd bled. Whose names were engraved in bronze and polished by invisible janitors at midnight. I remember your voice, Haynes said behind her. During the surgery. You talked the whole time. Not to anyone else, to Chen. You told him what you were doing, why you were doing it, what to expect. You talked him through every cut like you were singing him to surgery. I've thought about that voice every day for 15 years. Megan didn't respond. The mop moved. Water spread. The tiles became clean again, one section at a time. What Haynes didn't know was that the intelligence operation was about to become very complicated. What he didn't understand was that being recognized was a liability, not just to her, but to the entire team waiting for her data, waiting for the evidence that would break the smuggling network operating through the memorial shipment logistics. What she couldn't tell him was that his presence here, his recognition of her true identity, was the beginning of something that would unravel her cover completely. 3 weeks of invisible work. 3 weeks of collecting fragments and patterns. And now a captain who'd been there in 2009, who'd watched her hands, who could confirm what the military had always known, that the volunteer coordinator mopping memorial plazas at midnight had been something entirely different all along. Haynes finally stood, his breathing controlled and steady. He moved toward the plaza's exit, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, I'll be at the next park ceremony. Saturday. The dedication for the new memorial wing. They're holding it at 2 p.m. I'm not scheduled for ceremonies anymore, Megan said. I know, Haynes said. But I wanted you to know anyway. He left. His footsteps faded. The plaza returned to its silence, broken only by water and dripping and the sound of Megan's breath, steady as a metronome. She continued mopping until nearly 1 a.m., when every tile gleamed and the plaza was clean enough to perform surgery on. Then she locked up the equipment, clocked out, and drove back to her apartment in the North District. She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table and opened her encrypted laptop and began writing a report for her handler. 3 weeks of observations. Kemper's phone patterns. Board member communications. The offshore account transfers. The way he'd systematically isolated her while consolidating control. All of it documented. All of it pointing toward a larger operation that used the memorial park as logistics cover. And one new variable, Captain Haynes knew. He couldn't unknow it. Which meant the timeline had just accelerated by weeks, maybe months. Saturday's ceremony would change everything. She just didn't know how yet. Saturday morning broke pale and cool over San Antonio Veterans Memorial Park. 200 people gathered in the central plaza, veterans in dress uniforms, Gold Star families holding photographs, local politicians positioning themselves near the podium for camera angles. The memorial wall rose behind them, limestone and shadow, names carved deep enough that rain never erased them. Megan stood at the perimeter in maintenance coveralls, pushing a trash cart with mechanical precision. She wasn't supposed to be here. Kemper's written warning had been explicit, banned from all veteran-facing duties, effective immediately. But the ceremony fell on her assigned janitorial shift, and she'd learned to move through spaces without being seen. A skill from Baghdad. A skill that had kept her alive. Captain Derek Haynes sat in the third row, dress uniform pressed sharp as a blade, watching her from across the plaza. He'd said nothing since the night he recognized her in the park, said nothing to Kemper, nothing to the staff, nothing to her. But his eyes tracked her movement like she was still the only person in the room who mattered. The ceremony began at 9. Mayor spoke, then a state senator, then a Silver Star recipient who'd lost both legs in Kandahar. The crowd listened with the particular stillness of people who understood the weight of names on walls. Megan continued working, collecting fallen programs from the grass, her movements deliberate and quiet. She could have been invisible. She wasn't. Then came Mr. James Brennan, 83 years old, retired Air Force logistics officer, speaking about his brother whose name sat forth from the top on the memorial. His voice was steady at first. He talked about growing up in San Antonio, about his brother enlisting in 1955, about receiving a folded flag 30 years later. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium. Nothing alarming. Nothing that signaled what was coming. Megan was 40 feet away when she saw his chest tighten. She recognized the sudden rigidity in his shoulders, the way his breath came in short gasps, the panic beginning to flood his face. Tension pneumothorax. One lung collapsed, pressure building in his chest cavity, heart beginning to compress. His mouth opened but no words came. He collapsed backward, missing the podium edge by inches, hitting the plaza tiles hard. The crowd froze. Someone screamed. A woman nearby, his daughter, probably, dropped to her knees beside him. The contracted EMTs rushed from their ambulance with equipment, both of them younger than 30, moving with the frantic energy of people following protocol without understanding urgency. They fumbled with oxygen lines. They called for a backup unit. Their radio crackled, ETA 8 minutes. Brennan's face was turning grey-blue. His daughter was sobbing. The crowd pressed backward and forward simultaneously, panic and morbid curiosity. Megan moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. She simply set down the trash cart and walked toward the podium, coveralls flapping loose around her frame. A janitor. Just a janitor. The EMTs didn't even look at her as she approached. She knelt beside Brennan, one hand on his collarbone, her fingers finding the landmarks of his anatomy by muscle memory, first rib, second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. Pain was data. His skin was clammy. His oxygen saturation was probably 70, maybe 65. She looked up at the nearest EMT. "Give me a ballpoint pen. Now." "We have this." "Ballpoint pen. He's got tension pneumothorax. You've got 8 minutes and he'll be in cardiac arrest in 3. The EMT hesitated for maybe half a second, then yanked a pen from his pocket. She took it, clicked the barrel free, held the hollow tube over Brennan's chest. Her hands moved on their own now, 47 months of training collapsing into 60 seconds of perfect certainty. She found the space between his ribs. The needle, the ballpoint barrel, went in smoothly. The hiss of air escaping was like a sigh, like his lungs finally breathing. Immediate. Unmistakable. Brennan's color changed within seconds. The grey-blue shifted toward pink. His breathing deepened. His daughter grabbed Megan's free hand and held it like it was the only solid thing in the world. "O2 up," Megan said to the EMTs. "Get him loaded now." Chest tube waiting at Cedar Creek. She stood up. The crowd was silent in the way that meant they'd all just watched something ordinary become extraordinary. Captain Haynes had his hand over his mouth. The EMTs were already moving, professional now, competent now that they understood they'd been seconds from a body bag. Kemper appeared at the podium's edge, his face the color of old concrete. The ambulance left with its lights running. The ceremony dissolved into fragmented conversations, people huddling, pointing back at Megan, who was already walking back toward her trash cart. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't wait for gratitude. She'd done what a nurse does when someone is dying. She'd learned long ago not to expect thanks for it. By Monday morning, Kemper had his suspension letter typed and waiting. His office door was open when he called her in, deliberately open, she understood, so the staff walking past could hear every word. Performative cruelty. Institutional violence dressed in policy language. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. She simply didn't acknowledge it anymore. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay pending investigation into unauthorized medical practice and repeated insubordination. His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed against the desk with the rhythm of a man trying not to scream. Your nursing license does not authorize you to perform field procedures at this facility. Your volunteer coordinator position does not grant you medical authority of any kind. You've exceeded your scope repeatedly and publicly. What he didn't say, that her intervention had saved a 200-person crowd from watching a man die. That the video was already circulating through the veteran community. That Captain Haynes was making phone calls. That everything Kemper had built on silent staff and controlled narratives was beginning to fracture. Megan's face showed nothing. She removed her park ID badge and set it on his desk. "Yes, sir. You're being escorted from the premises. Do not return to this facility." She nodded once and left his office, walked past the staff break room where 3 people were pretending not to watch, and went directly to her locker. The folded flag was still there, the one she'd carried since Baghdad, the one she'd held every night for 8 months while pretending to be someone ordinary. She picked it up, felt its weight, its impossible heaviness, and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Then she closed the locker for the last time. Security escorted her to the parking lot in silence. The guard was a retired Air Force sergeant named Williams, the only person who'd ever treated her like a human being. As she reached her car, he murmured without looking directly at her, "Thank you for saving Mr. Brennan." She didn't respond. Couldn't. If she spoke, something would break inside her that she'd spent 47 months learning to keep intact. What Kemper didn't know, what nobody at the park knew except her handler and 3 people at Army Intelligence, was that the last 8 months had never been about volunteering. Cedar Creek Medical hadn't hired her. The park had been her deployment, her theater of operations. She'd been placed at San Antonio Veterans Memorial Park to investigate a suspected weapon smuggling operation routed through memorial statue shipments. Contractor invoices that didn't match delivery receipts. A pattern in the manifests. A foreign buyer with a military call sign. She'd been 3 weeks from confirming the entire network, from identifying the people moving arms parts through veteran tributes like it was the most honest thing in the world. Now she had no cover. No access. No mission. No badge. Just a folded flag and a suspension letter and 8 months of work dissolving like smoke. At 3 in the morning, she sat alone in a diner on Interstate 35, the only customer in a place designed for people in transit. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, the truck stop neon bleeding red across her shoulders, while 18-wheelers roared past outside like they were running from something. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The waitress had refilled it twice without comment, the way diner people did. On the table, her encrypted phone showing 7 missed calls from her handler, Major Sarah Chen at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the folded flag from her fallen teammate, heavy as a grenade. Megan picked up the flag, ran her thumb along the triangle's edge, the fabric worn soft from 8 months of touching it every night, and wondered if integrity was just another word for failure. She'd given up the mission to save an elderly man's life. By every military calculation, by every strategic measure, that was a catastrophic decision. But Mr. Brennan was alive. His daughter had both her parents still. She'd have to live with what came next. His office door stood open. That was deliberate. Ronald Kemper sat behind his desk with his hands folded, waiting, and Megan walked in knowing exactly what this was. The suspension letter sat centered on the mahogany surface like a place setting at a funeral. Through the open doorway, she could hear footsteps slowing in the hallway, voices dropping, staff members pretending not to watch as their volunteer coordinator, the woman who'd just saved Thomas Brennan's life with a ballpoint pen, was about to be erased. "Please sit," Kemper said. Megan didn't sit. She stood with her hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart, the posture of someone who'd stood at parade rest 1,000 times. Her scrubs were freshly cleaned. Her badge was clipped to her collar. She looked, to anyone passing that open door, exactly like what she was pretending to be, a nurse. Effective immediately, Kemper began, his voice carrying just loud enough to reach the hallway. "You are suspended pending investigation into multiple violations of park safety protocols and liability requirements." He lifted the letter. His fingers were soft, manicured. Specifically, providing medical intervention without proper authorization, engaging in procedures beyond your volunteer scope, and reckless endangerment of both patient and facility. The words were surgical. Precisely calculated. Liability concerns. Safety protocols. Language that sounded institutional, justified, reasonable, the kind of administrative language that would look perfect in a court filing or a board meeting. Megan's face remained absolutely neutral. A muscle didn't twitch. Her breathing stayed even. Her eye stayed fixed on a point slightly above Kemper's head, a technique she'd learned in interrogation resistance training at Fort Bragg. "You don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you register the hit. You'll surrender your badge, your access card, and your keys," Kemper continued. "You're barred from the park grounds until the investigation concludes. Human Resources will contact you with details about unemployment benefits." He set the letter down and slid it across the desk with 2 fingers. "You can go." Megan picked up the letter. Her hands were steady. She turned and walked out, and in that 3-second walk from his office to the hallway, every staff member who'd been pretending not to watch suddenly found something very important to do. The break room door clicked shut. Jorge, the groundskeeper who'd once nodded at her, abruptly needed to check the sprinkler system. The administrative assistant became deeply invested in her computer screen. The letter trembled. Not her hands. The paper itself, because it was cheap stock and she was holding it like evidence. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, alone in her apartment, Megan watched Kemper's next move play out through the park's internal messaging system, which she still had access to, for now. At 9:11 p.m., he sent a mass email to the park board members, a fabricated timeline of incidents documenting a pattern of negligence, staffing records that had been subtly altered to show previous complaints about her judgment, personnel files with timestamps she knew had been manipulated because she'd been present for none of the supposed incidents. He was building a paper trail in real time, creating the appearance of institutional concern so thorough that anyone reviewing the record later would see a reasonable supervisor forced to act. Then at 10:22 p.m., the reassignment notice came through. Marcus Washington, the only other veteran employee on staff, the one veteran who'd acknowledged her presence, who understood what it meant to serve, was being transferred to the satellite location at North Star Park 43 miles across town, effective immediately. No explanation. No consultation. Marcus had worked at the Memorial Park for 6 years. Suddenly, he was gone. Megan's only potential ally removed from the board like a chess piece. By 11:15 p.m., Kemper had made 3 phone calls. Megan didn't know about those calls, not yet. But she would learn later that those calls went to 3 of the 5 park board members, the ones whose names appeared on the Memorial Fund disbursements, the ones who'd been receiving consulting fees for contractor recommendations that Kemper had personally selected. The calls were brief. Professional. A request to ensure her removal was permanent, the kind of request that sounded less like coercion and more like a shared understanding between colleagues protecting their mutual interests. By midnight, Megan was driving. The 24-hour diner on Interstate 37 was the kind of place that existed at the edge of every city, fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps, coffee that had been brewing since 6 a.m., and a parking lot that saw more suffering than most emergency rooms. She sat in a corner booth, her folded flag heavy in her jacket pocket like an anchor threatening to sink her. The coffee grew cold. She didn't drink it. She just stared at her reflection in the dark window, at the outline of a woman who looked like she'd been hollowed out and replaced with someone else's skin. The neon sign for Budweiser reflected in her pupils like tiny, cruel advertisements. She'd sacrificed 8 months of deep cover. 8 months of pretending incompetence, of asking questions that seemed innocent but were actually surveillance, of watching contractors come and go with memorial statue components that had been retrofitted with weapons parts, components destined for secondary buyers in Eastern Europe. She'd been 72 hours away from closing the smuggling network, from handing her intelligence handlers a complete manifesto of involvement, from shutting down the operation that had been running for 4 years through the park's warehouse. And then Captain Derek Haynes had collapsed. And she'd saved his life. And everything had burned. The mission was gone. The operation was exposed. The window of opportunity had slammed shut the moment she'd stepped forward in that crowd instead of letting a trained EMT manage the situation. One decision, one act of compassion, and she'd traded her entire mission for a man's heartbeat. The Army intelligence operation investigating the weapons trafficking would stall now, might die completely. The handlers at Joint Base San Antonio would pull her, would reassign her, would find someone else to infiltrate the network, someone who didn't have her clearances, didn't know the players, would take months to build credibility. She was good at hiding. That was her job. But she was better at being a medic. That was her calling. And those 2 things had just collided in a parking lot under stadium lights, and the impact had scattered her across the concrete like shrapnel. Megan touched the folded flag through her jacket pocket. Felt the weight of it. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, killed in the Al-Rashid Mosque bombing, Baghdad, March 2009. The flag from his memorial service, folded by his mother's hands, given to Megan because Torres had died under Megan's hands when a mortar round had taken out the aid station and she'd been the only medical officer who'd made it out alive. She'd held that flag through 12 years of undercover operations, through 3 different identities, through a decade of people who had no idea who she actually was. And now Kemper had weaponized her heroism against her. He wasn't stupid. That was what made him dangerous. He understood that Megan wasn't a threat because she was reckless, she was a threat because she was competent. She asked questions. She noticed discrepancies. She understood accountability. So he'd removed her by making her integrity into a liability. He'd used her own medical skills as evidence against her. He'd isolated her allies. He'd altered records. He'd called in favors with the board members who were invested in his operation. He'd transformed her greatest strength into her fatal weakness. Megan opened her laptop at 1:38 a.m., right there in the diner, and began pulling documentation. Personnel files she'd memorized. Dates that didn't match. Invoice numbers that appeared twice. Contractor names that showed up on different memorial fund transfers. Email addresses that routed through offshore servers. She'd been trained to notice patterns, to document evidence, to build cases that could survive legal scrutiny. Her entire military career had been preparation for exactly this moment, the moment when she'd have to choose between the mission and the integrity that the mission was supposed to protect. She chose integrity. One document at a time, she began archiving what she'd seen. The discrepancies in the memorial fund donations. The contractor invoices that exceeded reasonable market rates. The shipping manifests that didn't align with statute dimensions. The security camera footage from her night shifts, footage she'd noticed was occasionally edited, occasionally missing clips, occasionally showing gaps that didn't make sense unless someone had been digitally erasing activities. By 3:14 a.m., she had 16 files on an encrypted drive. By 4:32 a.m., she had documentation of 7 months of suspicious activity. By 5:38 a.m., she had enough evidence to potentially expose not just Kemper's embezzlement, but the weapons trafficking network that was moving components through the park's warehouse and into supply chains that led to buyers the federal government was very interested in stopping. She didn't know yet about David Cho, the IT administrator in the Marine Reservist who'd been quietly archiving everything Kemper thought he'd erased. She didn't know that the hard drive she was creating would eventually be paired with Cho's encrypted backup, creating redundancy that would guarantee nothing could be hidden. She didn't know that by morning, General Vance would be walking into the park with federal investigators, or that by afternoon, Kemper would be in handcuffs, or that by evening, 200 veterans would turn their backs on him in silence. She only knew, sitting alone in a diner with cold coffee and a folded flag, that some things mattered more than operations. Some things mattered more than assignments. Some things mattered more than the mission itself. The flag felt lighter in her pocket now. She ordered fresh coffee and kept working. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.